let's talk about US aid to Ukraine. I've noticed a little bit of a talking point that's being passed around the various social media platforms. The ones that I like to frequent especially, the Reddits, the Instagram if we're being a little bit exotic. In any case, I've noticed a lot of commenters starting to almost copy and paste two, let's call them talking points, or in other words, propaganda. But let's be nice here, we'll call them talking points to be civil. These two talking points, as it were, seem to be gaining traction more and more amongst, as the terminally online folks might call them, normies, but frankly, it's a bit cringe. So let's call them your average person, your average Joe, that are not exactly, let's say, the most politically literate on the planet, seem to be regurgitating these talking points more and more, and that's causing me a bit of concern. Of course, if I take these two talking points and boil them down into one main concept or idea, it's really the idea that Ukrainian military or financial aid is somehow being quote-unquote wasted. The reality of the situation in any aid sent to Ukraine is just an astronomical return on investment for the United States and, frankly, US taxpayers. By all accounts, the aid being sent to Ukraine, again, either in financial or in a literal material sense, is not only a net positive for the US and our Western allies, or more broadly, NATO members, but on top of it, it's also a moral good that cannot be argued against in any objective sense outside of an appeal to emotion, which, ooh boy, both of the main talking points that I just mentioned are exactly that. If you'll allow me, I would love to dissect both of these for you and help to kind of guide you through the idea of how misinformation campaigns work with this nice little subset of an example on Ukrainian foreign aid. So let's talk about those two big talking points that I've taken the liberty of really more or less boiling down into their core components. Point one can more or less be summarized as a pretty simple sentence, but one that is nevertheless pretty effective, and frankly, if you said it to me, on the face of it, it's kind of hard to argue against, but fortunately, we're both a little bit smarter than that. We can argue against it. That idea is that we should spend the money we're sending to Ukraine at home. And it's a beautiful talking point. If you really just listen to it, it really just sinks into you, right? Why are we sending these Ukrainians? I don't know a Ukrainian. I don't know anyone that knows a Ukrainian. What the heck is that? People with weird last names in New York? I don't know, they make hot dogs, right? Something stupid like that. Most Americans can't really point out where Ukraine is on a map, let alone where, let's be honest, France is on a map. The idea that we're sending billions upon billions, and I believe as of recent numbers, over $200 billion worth of either financial or material aid to Ukraine, a country that, again, most Americans could probably barely point out on a map, is a pretty easy and quite effective talking point on its face. But the grand irony here, and the thing that most people outside of the gullible and the propagandized know when they say these types of sentences, is the fact that any money that's being sent to Ukraine is going to be immediately recycled and funneled back into the American economy. Now, of course, that's assuming that any sort of military aid being sent to Ukraine is military aid that we need to use as Americans. Of course, this isn't true, and any cursory Google search or any sort of primary source search, including, frankly, the very nice and clean Department of Defense press release statements, honestly, check them out. I know it sounds really boring and not very sexy to say, but to be honest with you, they're nice. They're really easy. Infographics are straightforward. Honestly, the Biden administration's killing it on the infographic game. As a former PowerPoint master myself, day job, it's pretty good. But my gushing about decent PowerPoints and overall infographic design on government websites aside, the military aid that's being sent to Ukraine currently is, if not entirely, the vast majority of which is incredibly old stockpiles of weapons, technology, and or actual vehicles being sent that are either destined for a mothballed desert field in New Mexico for some depressed Pentagon contractor to sit and look over for the next 20 years. It's frankly material that's just going to be sold anyway. In reality, this type of talking point when it comes to we should spend money at home is not only on the face of it silly, but on top of it, even if any of these materials do need to be replaced, who's gonna replace the materials? I'll give you a second to think. It's not very hard to really process this. Have you ever heard of, I don't know, Lockheed Martin, Boeing, Raytheon, anything? Any of those ringing a bell? All of those are born and raised American companies, baby. Yeehaw, we're going to Oklahoma and we're gonna buy a thermonuclear missile. All of the rearmament that may be needed are not current weapons that we are going to be using. Or they're in the beta phases that needed to be tested anyway. So for example, recent shipments of different types of drones that are currently being prototyped at the Pentagon or through various types of acquisitions programs those being sent would need to be used in some sort of conflict or sold or tested in a laboratory anyway. And what better way for any of you science nerds out there is there to gather real world data? It's in the field. Well, there you go. The point being, if you ever run across one of these talking points, know that there are two options for the individual posting that type of comment. Option one, they're completely propagandized, which means they're likely either, to be blunt, too stupid to understand what they're typing and what they actually believe, or point two, that they're malicious and they know exactly what they're saying, but they believe the propaganda hook, line, and sinker because it serves a larger objective, which we'll get to in a minute. So, moving on to talking point number two, it's really just talking point more or less along the lines of, well, we could use that money to help build a better medical system that doesn't bankrupt Americans. Which, on the one hand, is kind of funny in a way, because anyone that has a cursory knowledge of American politics knows that neither the Republican Party nor most mainstream Democrats are in support of some sort of nationalized healthcare system in the United States of America. So the idea that we're going to suddenly and magically take all of this gigantic amount of money that we're sending to Ukraine, or will be spent on any sort of market improvement in the medical system for Americans if we just simply leave to fend for themselves against an imperialist and authoritarian neighbor invading them for committing the grave crime of existing in opposition to Russian imperialism on their borders, is obviously on its face completely ludicrous. Unfortunately, a lot of people do fall for this line. It's actually, again, pretty insidious in the sense that most Americans are going to have an experience with this awful medical system that we have, but on top of it, equating supporting an independent democratic country against an authoritarian country invading them doesn't somehow negate from the ability for the United States of America to create a more equitable and humane healthcare system in our country. In reality, supporting an independent democratic country is a fundamental reality and necessity to ensure that global democratic societies can continue on liberalization campaigns in the face of a rising and rapidly growing right-wing populist movement globally. So no, cutting aid to Ukraine is not going to somehow create a better healthcare system. We're not going to suddenly have Shinkansen, Japanese bullet train style express services from Boston to DC in 3 hours simply because Ukraine is now a colony of Russia. Or we're not going to have some sort of sudden gold-plated Trump Tower-esque hospital system simply because Ukraine was allowed to be invaded and steamrolled so that we could have some extra lattes during our blood work appointments. Obviously, all of this is complete and utter nonsense. But again, it's a very insidious and very good appeal to emotion for most people in the United States. The irony is that anyone posting this talking point, especially in comparison or at least in contrast to talking point one, that being the generalized let's keep the money at home attitude, knows exactly what they're doing with this point. If you've taken the time to actually look up how much money is being spent and sent to Ukraine in foreign aid, that ranging northwards of around $200 billion in almost 2 years at this point, is not even remotely enough to fund any sort of substantial or meaningful improvements of the United States healthcare system. Again, if you are informed on this issue, it would be somewhere around the $1 trillion mark to even begin making a dent in the inefficiencies and issues in the United States healthcare system. So this point is not only silly, but frankly, it's insulting in a way. Now, you may be wondering, why is that insulting? Well, it's actually quite easy. In reality, anyone posting this is, frankly, going to be some sort of political operative or, well, to be honest, so stupid they're not even worth interacting with. But this gets to the more broader point about the current round of Ukrainian foreign aid being held up in Congress. Now, it probably shouldn't surprise you too much to learn that the Republican Party is the main obstacle to having this aid package being passed in Congress. And just as much as the individuals posting these know that these talking points are nonsense, Republicans in Congress also know that holding foreign aid to Ukraine for some sort of quote-unquote principled fiscal conservatism or fiscal nationalism is probably one of their fun little buzzwords they'll come up with in a short term. Watch out for that one. It's really insidious. They're holding the aid package up because they could care less about the immense amount of slaughter and disgusting acts of mass murder that is being committed by the Russian army and its various militias that it supports in the Donbass and eastern Ukraine in general. Fundamentally, aid to Ukraine is a 10-to-1 ROI That's return on investment in fancy finance talk because, again, Republicans like to act like they're very enlightened, very businessy people. They just really like numbers and money, and that's all they really focus on in these things. So next time you have a little bit of an argument with your crazy uncle that just watches Fox News all day, start throwing out these little acronyms. You'll sound a lot smarter. Anywho, using previously manufactured and fundamentally outdated armaments and generally financial aid being given to Ukraine is not only an amazing investment in the Ukrainian people and a country that is on its way to joining the European Union, in due time, of course, in due time, but it's also helping to do one of the best objectives that any sort of American military aid can do. It's to kill Russian dvatniks, aka getting rid of Russian soldiers, which is what this material was designed to do in the first place. With all of this being said, I hope you're able to start picturing what I'm really getting at. Any supposed quote-unquote reasonable opposition to Ukrainian aid really comes from either a fundamentally deranged or simply a propagandized perspective that is really not worth your time. Of course, unless this is a propagandist speaking. In which case, if you're able to identify that an individual is posting comments in support of blocking Ukrainian aid, well, frankly, just give them a pat on the back. I'm sure Putin will love them in the end. Spasiba, tovarish. Regardless of how you may feel about the validity of any of these talking points, and again, I can empathize to a degree, it is hard sometimes. When you can't pay your medical bills, but you're seeing that we're spending this much money abroad, it can be a little bit frustrating. But at the end of the day, all you have to do is look at the amount of corporate welfare we deal out every year in congressional budgets, and hopefully you'll start to froth at the mouth and rage at the amount of nonsense and money that we spend on companies that absolutely do not need it, while the average American gets poorer and struggles on a daily basis. The fundamental reality is that Putin has already begun his victory lap, as the latest round of congressional approval for Ukrainian aid has still been stalled due to Republican obstructionism. Recent reporting by the New York Times, amongst other mainstream news outlets, have indicated that some Ukrainian aid was freed up for the purposes of aiding the Ukrainians. However, this is not entirely accurate, and the New York Times itself did clarify that the main round of congressionally approved foreign aid budget is currently being held up due to, quote-unquote, budget negotiations for the new year. Blocking Ukrainian aid, even if, in some crazy different dimension, it was ineffective on any level, is incredibly worth it, if for nothing else, to give Putin and the Kremlin a major bloody nose without losing a single American in the process. Of course, that's ignoring the enormous amount of material, moral, and international standing that the United States gains by completely arming the Ukrainians, as we are today, let alone the fact that we are, in my view, still, well, frankly, dragging our feet on giving the Ukrainians what they really need to actually end this war quickly and decisively. That is, let's get some F-16s in there, we'll get a few Tom Cruises flying over Ukraine, everything will be fine. Anywho, I hope this video has been informative at the very least, and at best given you a chuckle while helping to educate you on some of the trends that I've been noticing as an individual online. Since this is my first public video, I figure I should do one of those fancy sign-offs, but before I do that, I figured I'd give you a bit of an introduction to who I am. While I know the political YouTube scene can be filled with a lot of talking heads that, to be honest, don't really have any idea of what they're talking about at the best of times, I'd like to think both on an academic and professional level, I'm able to help analyze some of today's most pressing issues with both objectivity and a little bit of humor. But time will tell if that lands. In the interim, you can call me Ilaria, and we'll talk again soon. Bye-bye.